So, Dr. Nagra, welcome to the Sakara Life podcast. We'd love to hear, what is your mission here? What are you here to do or give or share?
I'm really just here trying to help people eat healthier, make healthier choices. I think that a lot of people want to make healthy choices, but the information is so mixed and confusing and contradictory that it makes it really difficult for people to make those decisions. So I'm just trying to clear up the noise and allow people to make informed decisions about their health.
I don't think there's ever been more noise than there is right in this moment. And we're pretty familiar with a lot of like the literature around diet, nutrition. But I think, like, how do you personally sort through the noise? Because even as somebody who, we've been doing this for 15 years, I have my master's in nutrition. Like, even as somebody who is deep in this world, like, I sometimes find it so hard to cut through the noise. But then when you do go back to the literature over and over, it does tend to, it's without trend, which is nice, and does tend to point to the same thing. So how do you think about sorting through the noise out there, and even the noise as it pertains to the scientific literature?
I mean, I sort of review new studies in the context of what has already been done before. Like I don't look at every single study as it's a single piece of literature that I'm going to base my opinion or position around. I look at, well, how does this compare to the decades of research we had prior, which I've largely reviewed already. And then if there are differences, that's where I really dive deep into the methodology, into the supplementary data, um, to kind of uncover, well, why is this different than the other one? And it might be a case of, oh, the study's done on a different population. For example, maybe we had studies on like middle-aged adults before, and this one is finding some different results, say with regard to protein intake in those who are 65 plus, or it's those little details often that still need to be worked out a little bit, but the overall picture is pretty clear and very consistent. So if I see a contradictory study, I'm not going to just throw everything out. I'm going to look at, well, why is this one different? And that usually helps paint a clearer picture.
And when you look to the literature and, the past decade or two of what it's been saying, what do you tell people to focus on when it comes to nutrition? Obviously, there are outlier cases and allergies, et cetera. But, if you had to bucket everyone in one bucket, what do you believe is the diet that works best for most people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence is pretty clear that plant predominant diets, at the very least, are among the healthiest, and then you can fill in the sort of edges with different things. So, for example, centering a diet around what I like to call five of the like key plant food groups would be fruits, veggies, whole grains, legumes, and nuts and seeds. And then around the edges, if you include animal products, having some fish or dairy or very small amounts of meat can fit into that. But if you're going plant exclusive, which is what I do, and I know many others do who will listen to this, then again, you can focus on those whole plant foods, or you could fill it in with some more of what you may call treats or things like that as well. The 5 to 10% of your diet isn't really going to dictate the effect that it has on your health. It's the 90% of your diet that really matters. And so you'll see people on both sides of or maybe there's more than two, all sides of the diet spectrum, arguing that their extreme way of eating is the best, bar none. And there just isn't evidence to support that. We can look at studies comparing vegan diets or plant exclusive diets to pescatarian diets to low meat consumption omnivorous diets. And as long as diet quality is similar, you end up getting roughly the same results. And so that's what ultimately matters.
Do you think that quality of the food plays a big role in the outcomes? Like if it's
Can you
organic, if
define
it's high
quality of the
quality?
food? Okay.
So if it's organic, if
Actually,
it's processed or not.
okay, so I actually want to touch the process topic first really quickly because this is one that we've got a lot of data over the last maybe 4 or 5 years. Um, the idea of processing, or more specifically, ultra processing. So these are foods that are produced primarily in factories using industrial ingredients. Um, they have gotten a really bad rap, and partially rightfully so. If we look at ultra processed foods in general, those who consume the most do have poorer health outcomes in general than those who consume less. And it's the numbers keep shifting a little bit, but roughly 60 to 70% of the American population is getting about 60 to 70% of the calories in the average American's diet is coming from ultra processed foods. And so that's a huge, huge amount. But within that spectrum of ultra processed foods, there's huge variety. You have everything from donuts to sausages to sodas to whole grain cereals and whole wheat bread. And on that spectrum, you're going to have different impacts on your health. The processed meats like the sausages and the sugar sweetened beverages like the Coca Cola, those are very consistently associated with poor outcomes. But we now have research that separates out the different types of ultra processed foods, and we see that the whole grain products, so whole wheat bread, whole grain cereals, etc., are actually health promoting. They actually lower risks of cardiovascular disease, lower risks of diabetes. And I'm not talking about the super sugary refined grain based cereals. I'm talking about again those whole wheat based, whether they're oat based or whole grain based, whether they're oat based or whole wheat based or what have you. And then we can look at plant based meat alternatives, which fit somewhere on that spectrum, maybe a little more to the healthy side, depending on the composition. So does processing inherently matter? It's not super clear. In general, the highly processed foods are not so healthy, but there can be healthy versions. Now, on the organic side, I actually years ago was very much on the side that that was super important. Now, after reviewing the data on the topic, I'm not so convinced.
I'll debate you
there
on
are
that
only
one.
a few. Sorry.
I'll
Okay. Yeah,
debate you
we
on
can.
that one.
So if we Yeah, certainly can. If we look at the health outcome data, so risk of cancer outcomes, risk of mortality, there's very little data to begin with, and we don't see different in outcomes across the board. There might be a slightly higher risk of, one type of cancer with non-organic versus organic, but then actually organic consumers have a slightly higher risk of other types of cancers, and it ends up being sort of a wash in the available data. We can speculate around mechanisms, but at the end of the day, what I care about most are the outcomes.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think also just on that point, like I just had to travel I was in Idaho, I was in Minnesota, I was in Illinois. And I think when you realize, as you pointed out, Dr. Nagra, that like most people are getting 60 to 70% of their calories from ultra processed food, the logical best next thing is like focus on whole foods. Where they're coming from probably matters much less. Now, if I'd be so interested, it's going to be really hard to do this, but maybe one day is like to really understand, like if we could get all those people onto a whole food diet and see that transformation, and then start to compare that group to a group that was doing organic. And maybe we've done something like this. I'm not familiar, but it's like and maybe I think sometimes organic is also not the lens we should be using. Like, what if the freshness? What about like, the time it took from it to get from the plant to your plate? Like, there's so many things that I think we could look at to start to understand. But I feel like we're so far, most of the population is so far away from just getting a whole food, plant rich diet that we have a lot of work to do. And I see people speaking out saying like, stop talking about organic all the time, stop making it seem hard for people. And I always used to fight that idea because, we do believe organic is so important. We also tend to work with a population who is trying to like refine and like, turn the volume up on their health a little bit. And they're already doing everything else they can possible. And so you have these little ways that you can dial up your health potentially. But when we look at the population as a whole, I feel like we're still so far away from getting people into this really good place where they can feel good in their bodies, we call it, sitting in the driver's seat of their health. But yeah, making sure people understand that if you're going to do anything first, it's focusing on a whole food, plant-rich diet.
Yeah,
I certainly agree with that.
I also feel like the science to test some of these outcomes just isn't there yet as well, or maybe the funding for testing something like that isn't there yet. So, we had Stephanie Seneff on our podcast, and she talked a lot about glyphosate and the mechanisms of how these pesticides and herbicides work and they work on the chicken-mate pathway, and that's why they're approved as safe, quote unquote safe, for human consumption or use on humans' food, because we don't have that pathway. But we're filled with little bugs, little microbes and different symbiotic bugs that live within us that are necessary for our health. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface when it comes to the microbiome and what it does for us and the health outcomes associated with damaging that gut microbiome.
Well, see, that's fair as a speculation on what could be, but that's where I would leave it. It's not something that I would base a position around. For example, we can talk about mechanisms all day, right? We can look at exercise; it causes inflammation. Does that mean exercise is bad? No, because it leads to good outcomes. We can look at smoking and the fact that it has appetite suppressant properties and it affects nicotinic receptors in the brain, and these could potentially be good things, but on the net, smoking is bad. And so when we look at the outcome data we have for organic versus non-organic, like again, actual cancer outcomes in the few cohorts that are available, um, actual mortality outcomes, I believe there's like one about that. We generally see it's a wash, and that's why like we can speculate around these mechanisms, but if the results are the same, then I don't see why it would be
But
something worth really
right, but
hammering
that's
down
why
on.
I'm saying that the science just isn't there yet, because I would be testing more for autoimmune conditions, leaky gut, things, different disease outcomes that come from having a leaky gut, from having missing microbes, essentially. That if we're spraying antibiotics on our food, then what is that doing to the bugs in our gut? But again, I'm just
And I
talking about concepts and speculation here, like you're saying, but also saying that I think that in this world of nutrition and nutrition science, that it's only the data that we have is only as good as the human research and as the human science that we have. I think that we're still at the beginning of understanding the world of nature, of food, of our bodies, and that there's still more to research and more to learn as well.
Sure, but I wouldn't take that to assume that it's going to be harmful. Like that's the concern that I have with. We know for a fact that say fruit and veggie consumption is good for us. We know for a fact that whole grain consumption is good for us, and the vast majority of people that are consuming those foods in these studies are non-organic. The predominant amount of consumption is non-organic, and so we know that making those choices is beneficial. But then if we make people stay concerned around non-organic foods, you actually see people shift away from those foods. You don't see them shift
Right.
away from non-organic towards organic. You actually see people eat less of those foods, and that's my biggest concern because one,
Yeah.
it's a speculation. We actually don't have good evidence suggesting harm in this case. There are huge safety nets built into the exposures that we get for those compounds, and the outcome data that we do have is essentially a wash. And so that's why I would be really concerned around messaging that non-organic foods are harmful for all of those reasons.
And I think it's less the messaging that non-organic are harmful and that organic is better. I guess you would and then obviously be saying it's harmful. But I think I've been thinking a lot about this idea of public health versus individual health. And that at some point they just naturally conflict because there once you kind of group people into that group, it's no longer like they no longer understand. You're constantly looking outside yourself for health information instead of internally. And so, yes, there's a lot of work to do to get people to eating a whole food, plant rich diet. And that's always what we want first and foremost. But then if you start to zoom in a little, what are the ways that you can teach people to understand how they feel in their body? And like maybe this is something like, as Whitney, I think you're, trying to say is like, we're probably really far away from understanding why maybe life energy in a tomato matters. Like, I think as a spiritual person, I can start to understand and hypothesize why eating a tomato right off the vine would make me feel better than a tomato that's 6 weeks old because it's been covered in blah, 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 blah. There's no study that's going to show me that right now, and maybe there never will be. But what is my internal compass maybe my internal beliefs, which matter, that help me kind of dictate what is best for my health. And so we talk about this idea a lot of the body intelligence. How do you sit in the driver's seat of your health? How do you start to understand? We tend to get a lot of the clients that's like, I'm doing everything I should be, and I still don't feel great. So, like, what are the things that we can start to dig into? What is your relationship to food? How and when are you eating? How do you relate to your worthiness? Because your plate is a reflection of what you feel about yourself. So I've been just thinking about public health is so important. We live in a very large country. We can learn so much from being public health advocates and understanding these big cohort studies, but we can never understand an individual's health better than they can, as long as, like, I think we have to start teaching the tools to start to tune in and understand what does actually make me feel good. But I'd love to so you started out talking about how you are vegan and eating a plant-forward diet is very important across the literature. And that the literature doesn't really care about the trends, which is so refreshing. So let's talk about some of the myths that you see. So that probably all three of us see all the time. And the obvious one is protein. You see all the memes out there that's like, I never thought I'd spend most of my day thinking about protein. We get the question all the time. When we started Sakara in 2011, people didn't know what the microbiome was. People didn't even know what plant-based meant. Like, we were helping define it for people. And so this is part of wisdom, right? We've been doing it for over a decade. And so trends come and go. And when we started, we hit unknowingly a very big trend. And now it's like protein is this trend, and it's so fascinating to watch. Like, if I take my entrepreneurial side, my business owner side out of it, and just more witness what is happening, you start to see how things snowball off of opinions and not any real evidence. So can you talk to us, like, what does the literature say when it comes to how much protein people should be eating, and the source? Because what I have understood is that the source between animal and plant is very minimal when we think about muscle synthesis.
But if you're listening to Instagram or TikTok,
there's
they make it a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's a few different myths or misconceptions sort of built into the protein topic. So the first one is about how much we need. We have one side of the spectrum saying you need to go crazy and have like a gram per pound or more. And then you have the other side, especially in the plant-based community, where some people will say, oh, it doesn't matter at all. Maybe that's a bit of exaggeration of what they say, but either way, two sides of the spectrum. Now, with the amount, the RDA, recommended dietary allowance in the US and Canada, and this is similar across the world as well, is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So you take your weight in kilograms, multiply by 0.8, and that would be the amount that you need. Now, that's enough to cover the majority of the population's needs as far as maintaining what we call a positive nitrogen balance, or basically taking in more protein than you're losing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the ideal amount. And if we look at research over the past several years now, first started really digging into this, I want to say around 2019, 2020, we look at the ideal amounts being maybe around 1.1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So again, that's your weight in kilograms times about 1.2. That would be 50% higher than the RDA. And that amount is associated with greater muscle gains, better bone health in randomized controlled trials, at least among elderly populations. And then roughly that amount is associated with lower risks of mortality as well, so premature death. And so this has led me to recommend going a bit higher. That's still not a crazy amount. That's enough, or that's the amount that someone could pretty easily get in their diet if they're having some protein-rich foods with their meals, and that includes on a plant-based diet if you're having things like tofu and whatnot. But then if you're looking to maximize muscle and strength gains, you could go even higher. You could go all the way up to about 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is double the RDA. And that is the point at which there doesn't appear to be further benefit. So increasing beyond that doesn't lead to more muscle or strength gains. It just sort of plateaus at that point. And so it just really depends on an individual's goals. For general health and to be able to, perform in the gym, put on muscle and all that, 1.2 grams per kilogram is fine. But if you're looking to squeeze out every ounce of gains that you can, then going a bit higher to 1.6 grams per kilogram is a solid target. And then, of course, that leads us into the sort of protein or the protein source debate, animal and plant. So, any questions about that stuff before I kind of move into that?
Yeah, can you like I don't know the kilogram math pound
Okay.
to kilogram in my head. So like 150-pound woman, let's say, what is
Yeah.
that in kilograms and how many grams of protein?
So in kilograms, that'd be divided by 2.2, or for
Okay.
pounds. I know the 1.6. The 1.6 number per kilogram is about
It's
0.75 grams per pound.
so 150
Okay.
pounds
Yeah.
is 68 kilograms.
Yeah. So if
Yeah.
it were 0.8, that'd be 54 grams of protein for a 150-pound woman. And you were
Mhm.
saying you recommend now 1.2?
Yeah. So about
Okay.
50% higher than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I should have those calculated. I
So
know
like
for,
80,
yeah.
80 grams of protein for a 150-pound woman. And before we get into the source, I feel like one of the conversations, certainly around the carnivore diet, et cetera, is, or even just a high protein conversation, is one, most people are not actually counting their grams of protein. Rather, I see people eating, and I'm using air quotes here, like meatballs for breakfast, a huge steak for lunch, salmon for dinner. And so that's already probably 170 grams of protein. And so I think like the conversation around like, yes, maybe optimizing and thinking, because this was one of the early, like first reasons we started Sakara was we found eating this way to be so transformative to our health and how we felt in our body and so overwhelming to meal plan. Because, yes, everybody should be meal planning in some way because it used to be we would eat off the seasons and we would have a lot more time to cook. And now we're all so busy. And so, in order to get the diversity of foods onto your plate at every single meal, it does take a lot of planning. But the nice thing is that when you tend to like get that diversity, your bases tend to be covered. Like I can easily get 75 grams of protein a day as long as I focus on getting that diversity of plants. I am not vegan, but most of my days are plant-based. And I don't find it hard to get that 70 to 80 grams of protein a day. I don't really think this ended up being a question per se, except just to say it takes so much like meal planning. And this was my question is I think what's lost in the conversation is it's always what you gain from more protein and never what, like more is not always better. And I think we don't have that conversation enough of like what else is happening on a metabolic level or on a physiological level, on a cellular level when you are getting too much protein. So if I'm, somebody who's moderately active, I'm getting my 80 grams of protein. If all of a sudden I go up to 170 grams because I'm just trying to get more and more and more and more protein, what does that do? What does that mean for someone?
Right.
Does it
Like,
have adverse effects?
and I think that a lot of people think that, oh, I'll just eat more protein and I'm going to get more muscle. Or like, I'm not going to lose muscle and so I'm not going to be flabby. And a lot of people don't do the work then at the gym. So like, how much do you have to exercise to use that protein? And what happens if you're eating too much protein in excess and not exercising?
Yeah, so there was a meta-analysis in I want to say 21. I could be a little off, maybe 2022, looking at protein studies, so trials where they gave one group extra protein and the other group had lower protein intake, and then they divided them into studies where people were resistance training and where people were not resistance training. So if you just up the protein without resistance training, it did pretty much nothing, like little to nothing as far as any sort of gains. But in those who were resistance training, there was added benefit as far as muscle gains up to around that 1.5, 1.6 gram per kilogram mark. And so, yeah, the resistance training component is very important. In fact, it's the most important component when it comes to actually building muscle. You could have a lower protein intake and resistance train, and you'll put on more muscle than somebody with a higher protein intake who's not training. And so
That's what I
that's
was going
really
to ask
important.
was like,
Yeah.
was there a control group in there for people who resistance trained without increasing their protein?
Well, so they actually compiled the studies that we had on the protein interventions, and then they separated them into those studies where there was not training and those studies where there was. So if you look at the studies with no
Got it.
training, going from zero protein to or not zero protein, zero added protein to the highest protein intake, there was very little change in actual strength outcomes. But then
Got
if
it.
you look at the studies where they were training, even those with the lowest protein intake, they still gain muscle, just not as much. And or gain strength rather, but just not as much. And then obviously with the higher protein up to a point, there was added benefit. So yeah, resistance training is by far the most important component there. I think everyone should understand that. I feel like it gets left to the wayside a bit, but that's the important take home point here. Now, as far as too much protein, there used to be concerns around kidney function, but we now have a number of randomized controlled trials that have not demonstrated any harm on kidney health in healthy people. So if you have chronic kidney disease, yes, restricting protein can be a good idea. And obviously you would work with your nephrologist on that. But protein per se doesn't seem to be detrimental to kidney function in a healthy person. The package may matter though. So if you look at red meat consumption, for example, it is associated with a higher risk of chronic kidney disease or declining kidney function. And that might have to do with the heme iron that's in there, maybe the high amounts of saturated fat, maybe other components that are causing some issues. Whereas higher plant protein intake, if anything, seems to be protective. So I wouldn't say it's protein per se. I'd say it depends on where it's coming from that really ultimately matters.
And
And
so
then
excess protein can turn into, if you're not using it then at the gym, what happens to it? Is it turned into energy and then how does your body store it?
Yeah, so some of it can be burned directly as energy. Otherwise, it's turned into carbohydrates and burned that way. Or if it is in excess of your overall caloric balance or caloric needs, well, then you can store it as fat as well, or store that excess energy as fat, whether it came just from the protein or not. So it ultimately, whether or not you're storing fat, comes down to how many calories you're consuming overall. But yeah, if you're loading up on protein and it's pushing you over whatever your caloric needs are for the day, then yeah, you're going to end up storing some of that energy as fat.
okay, so source of protein, you just said package matters. So plant versus animal protein, when you look at the studies, it's negligible. Is that what I've heard you say?
Yeah, so there's a few different. I don't know how detailed do you want me to get here? I can really get into the weeds.
You can get
Let's
into the
go.
weeds
Okay,
totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
okay. So yeah, so we'll break it down into sort of three topics or subtopics. The first is the protein amount. So people will say, you can't get enough, or you can't get as much protein from plants. And I would say, on average, if you were to go to a buffet and just choose the plant-based options, yeah, you're probably getting less protein than if you were having the animal-based options, just because more animal foods are high in protein versus plant foods. But if you specifically replace animal foods with high protein plant foods, you can get the same amount or even more protein. For example, your standard 80-20 beef, so this is like the 20% fat, 80% lean beef, has the same amount of protein per calorie as tofu, roughly. If you have something like textured vegetable protein, so like they're sort of meaty, but based on like soy protein, and they're basically just soy with a lot of the fat removed. That has more protein than your 80-20 beef, about the same amount as a 95 or 97% lean beef, so like extra lean meat. Seitan, which is a wheat-based protein, same deal. So you can replace these animal foods with the high protein plant foods and get roughly the same amount or more. If you replace dairy milk with soy milk or pea-based milk, you get about the same amount or more protein. If you replace eggs with a tofu scramble, you get more protein. If you replace it with like a chickpea omelet, you get about the same amount of protein. And so it comes down to just that knowledge of like what are those high protein plant foods that you can use to replace some of those high protein animal foods. And then of course, supplementation is an option as well. So yes, you can get the same amount of protein, but there might be a bit of a learning curve, especially for people who are new to eating that way. Now, the second thing that gets brought up is that plants don't contain all of the essential amino acids. So these are the 9 amino acids that we need to consume in our diet that we don't produce in our bodies. And that is just false. Every plant food contains every essential amino acid, but in varying proportions. So beans might have less of the amino acid methionine, but then grains have more of it and less of another amino acid called lysine. And as long as you're eating a variety of foods throughout your day, it's really not a concern. Where it would become a concern is if you only ate one food basically throughout your entire day, which obviously nobody's advocating for, and I would never advocate for. And so it's really not something that needs to be thought about too much, especially if you are getting what I'm suggesting as 1.2 grams per kilogram or more perhaps. Like you're going to get enough of each essential amino acid without putting much thought into it. Now, the third thing that gets brought up is bioavailability. So, how much of the protein are you absorbing? And this is one of the topics I think that is most misunderstood, even amongst protein researchers. Like, I've seen some people who literally did their PhD thesis on protein research, and they actually don't understand how these metrics are used or calculated, because they'll often cite the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, or the PDCAS, or the digestible indispensable amino acid score, or the DIAS. And these are protein scores that help sort of rate the quality of various protein sources. And you'll find that plant foods tend to do worse than animal foods. I mean, the range varies. You can have some plant foods like soy, for example, that scores very high in the 90s, mid 90s, out of 100. But then you'll have some that might score around like 60 or something. So the issues with these scoring systems, starting with the PDCAS, the older of the two, is that for one, it's measured in rodents, and we have different protein needs, we have different growth rates, different digestive tracts, so we can't necessarily translate that rate to humans. Two, they measure digestion throughout the entire digestive tract, which can also skew results because some of the microbes in the large intestine can chew up some of the protein. And then three, and this is the biggest one, they don't just tell you what percentage of the protein was absorbed. They actually look at the amount of protein you would get from the limiting amino acid. So the amino acid the food contains the least of. Okay. So if you were to measure beans and they're low in methionine, let's say they have 50% of your daily needs or whatever methionine in this specific serving that they're given. And let's say you absorbed even 90% of it, right? So that's a pretty good absorption, 90%. You would get a score of like 45 because you only get 90% of the 50% that amino acid is present in. But in reality, you're getting 90% of the protein, and you're probably going to eat other foods that are higher in methionine, right? It's like if you had this is the analogy I used when I was actually on the Rich Roll podcast, is that if you had a report card and it had 9 subjects, and we'll consider those the 9 amino acid or essential amino acids, and you were to get straight A's on 8 of them and then like a C minus on one of them, your report card would just read C minus. Like that's all it would say. And it wouldn't talk about the A's. Whereas if you were to average them, I don't know, it'd be an A minus or something like that. So that's how the scoring system is skewed. Now that same issue applies to the DIAS. There are some differences. It's measured in pigs. They also don't or they remove the protein from the end of the small intestine so it doesn't get again eaten up by some of the microbes. So that's one advantage there. And then but they also use raw foods like raw grains, raw legumes, which are less digestible than the cooked versions too. So there's another issue there. But at the end of the day, the biggest problem by far is the fact that they basically score you on the lowest present amino acid, which just doesn't pan out. When you look at like overall protein absorption, if you take a high quality plant protein and a high quality animal protein, it's like a few percent difference maybe. They're
Right.
very,
So
very comparable.
they're isolating a single food and assuming you're not gonna like eat other foods. And so your report card is a C. And so are you saying that like every animal-based protein source is closer to 100 or
closer? Yeah, they're usually in the like 80 to 100 range typically.
Yeah.
Whereas you'll get some plant foods that are like 50, 60, somewhere like that.
Got it.
But then like, going back or going from that to again, actual outcomes, which are important. If you look at the couple trials now we have where they actually pit a plant-based diet, whether it's 100% or like 90% or 95% plant-based versus an omnivorous diet, and have people resistance train for months and then measure their actual muscle and strength gains, you see no real differences between both groups. Both achieve similar muscle and strength gains. So clearly these supposed differences in bioavailability or amino acid profiles or what have you just don't matter. Like they do not matter at the end of the day because you get the same result. If they really did matter, you wouldn't get the same result.
Right. And I also think about it as like, the kind of puzzle or like the whole picture puzzle of what health might mean. And when you have a plant forward diet, you're getting so many other things. And if you naturally have to kind of sort of be more inclined to get diversity in a plant forward diet, there's so many other things, good things that happen from that diversity. We're zooming in on amino acid profile, but we also know that, diversity of different types of microbes in our gut tend to equal a healthier gut. And the best way to do that is get a diversity of plants. So this is also where, like, personally, and I know this is like, my own kind of personal opinion on how I think about things, but you just start to see thematically how things can make sense, where, like, if diversity is helping you make sure you're getting your amino acid profile, it's helping you make sure you have a healthy gut. And then when you look to like an animal sort of forward diet, it's like you're talking about TMAO, you're talking about low fiber. Like, I really want somebody to talk about bowel movements on the carnivore diet, but nobody has and nobody will. I just like, what is happening? Because I cannot imagine when you are getting like under 8 grams of fiber a day, when you're focused on protein and dairy only, like, I get really worried about the microbes in their gut. Is there any literature on this? No.
Well, I mean, there's research on like low fiber intakes, or rather, there's randomized controlled trials on fiber supplementation and improvements in
Right.
bowel frequency. And anecdotally, you'll see there's actually some big name carnivores who talk about how they poop once a week, or and apparently they think that's a good thing because you're not wasting anything, you're absorbing it all, or whatever logic they try to use for that. But like going to your point of like the other aspects of protein and health, I think something that is really underappreciated is the health outcome data with plant protein over animal protein. Like if you look at almost any study substituting animal protein for plant protein, they point towards the plant protein being beneficial. Even long-term cohort studies where they'll measure mortality outcomes. So like the risk of dying during the course of this study is substantially higher if you're consuming more animal protein, especially red meat protein in place of plant protein. And so that's like a huge picture. And when we consider protein quality, I think that's actually something that should be factored into the equation as well. How does it ultimately impact your health?
Yeah,
And
this is something that needs to be talked about because so many people right now are saying the reason why they're going on to a higher protein diet is for longevity purposes. They're being told that the number one thing they can do for longevity is to have more muscle. And in order to get more muscle, they need to eat more protein. But you're saying that's not always the case. That's not the best way to get the best outcome by increasing your animal protein.
Yeah, well, it depends totally on the source. So you're right. If you're focusing on animal, particularly again like red meat protein, that's problematic. If you're having a bit of fish protein or whatever, it's not quite the same. And then of course, plant protein is going to be very health promoting. But you see these people, especially promoting that message, often also promoting red meat consumption, which is where it becomes concerning.
And not to belabor this point, we don't have to go back to it, but in theory, this is where I'm also like, package does matter. Like, where your food is grown, how it's grown, like, maybe, we don't know exactly how yet, but it just starts to, like, theoretically, and I know it's in theory only, but like, it starts to make sense, like the form type, um, what it's grown in, how it's grown does tend to matter. But so in terms of more myths on plants, the other thing, you talked a lot about soy. I think that soy still really scares people in terms of breast cancer and phytoestrogens, and like
Man boobs.
men shouldn't be eating or drinking it. I'm actually so into soy milk. It's my favorite. It's what I give to my kids. Um, but like when I've told that to people, and we tend to like decrease soy in our program because we use actually a pumpkin-based tofu. It's really tasty and people love it. So there's that. But also it was because they were just so misinformed about tofu, and we just can't teach on every front. You have to meet people where they are. So what do the studies say about tofu, and what makes you so
Soy.
comfortable soy in general, and what makes you so comfortable to consume it?
Yeah, well, the concern around the estrogenic effects, they largely stem from the fact that soy contains these isoflavones, which are also often referred to as phytoestrogens, and that's because they have some structural similarities to the estrogens that we produce. So they aren't actually estrogen, but they can bind to estrogen receptors, and then people will speculate off of that they have these pro-estrogenic effects or feminizing effects, when in reality, uh, if we look at the randomized controlled trials, there was a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials or clinical trials by Reed and colleagues, published in 2020 or end of 2019. And then there was a more recent one looking at measures of estrogenicity in women, just published either January this year or late last year. And they found that there were no clinically significant effects on hormone levels or hormonal effects that, again, would be measured in these trials. So with women and estrogenicity, they were looking at like uterine lining thickness or menstrual cycles and all of that as well. So it wasn't just the levels of those hormones. And so with all of that data, it's quite clear that it's a safe thing to consume from that perspective. But what's sort of ironic is that they can actually have beneficial impacts in certain ways. So, for example, these phytoestrogens prefer to bind to specific receptors called beta receptors or estrogen receptor beta. And in breast tissue, those actually have anti-estrogenic effects. So, people are concerned about breast cancer because of these pro-estrogenic effects, when in reality, we actually see the opposite. And the long-term cohort studies suggest that those who regularly consume soy have a lower risk of breast cancer. In men, we see a lower risk of prostate cancer. And then in both, we see lower risks of cardiovascular disease and potentially other outcomes. So we see benefits across the board. We don't see any of these adverse hormonal effects. And it's a really good source of nutrition. It's one of the higher protein legumes. It's a great source of calcium and a number of other minerals.
And what is the actual concern, if we can just get into the details of it? So it potentially takes up the space in the estrogen receptor because it's so similar to estrogen. So is that what the concern is? Or is it that it upregulates estrogen? What is
Yeah,
the
that's the
actual
concern. The concern is that it'll basically increase the estrogenic activity, because it's going to just bind to more of the receptors and activate them without giving consideration to, well, some of those receptors might lead to anti-estrogenic effects, and also it binds much more weakly than our own estrogen. So like there are clearly differences, but at the end of the day, we have that outcome data. We have the studies looking at, again, measures of estrogenicity. We have studies looking at breast cancer risk, and we see benefits. So there really isn't reason to be concerned.
Right. Do you have any data around? I've heard something about the rates of breast cancer in Japan being much lower than the rates in America,
Mm-hmm.
and saying that that's related to their soy intake.
It could
Do you know
be.
anything about that?
So there's a couple things there. With the American studies, if we look at soy consumption, we actually don't generally see a huge benefit to soy consumption in American populations. And there's a couple of speculations as to why. The one to me that makes the most sense, actually, is that when you look at high consumption in American populations, it's like maybe a serving a week. It's probably less than that. It's like a serving a month. It's very, very little soy consumption here. Well, I'm in Canada, but in North America in general. And then when we look in Asian populations, high consumption daily, basically. Right? So you're comparing people consuming daily to maybe once a week over there, and here you're comparing consuming once every couple of weeks to once every couple of months. It's a massive difference. And so yeah, you're not going to see benefit from such little consumption. Now the other suggestion is that they tend to genetically be more predisposed to breaking down these isoflavones into other compounds called equal, which might also have some like anti-cancer effects and so on. And so that might be another reason that we see larger benefits in Asian populations, and maybe contributes to their overall lower risk as well. I'm not entirely clear on that. That's something that we could speculate around, but
Right.
I would
Also,
not be
what
shocked at all of
form?
soy consumption.
Right. Also, what form are they consuming natto, like fermented soybeans, versus some sort of more, a soy milk or a tofu or something like that in America? And does the fermentation piece add an element to it as well? I think, this is where some of the nutrition science can get a little murky as well.
So, in the studies that have broken it down by types or forms of soy, actually tofu is the one that most consistently is associated with benefit, and actually soy milk to a degree as well. But that's probably because they're the most widely consumed, even in Asia. Now, they do tend to consume more of the fermented stuff as well, whether that's tempeh or natto or miso and all of that. So yeah, there could be a component there. That's something that could be further teased out, but I would not write off tofu or soy milk. I think the evidence is pretty clear on those as well. Again, largely because they're the ones that are most widely consumed and we have the most data on them.
And so, as we sort of close out, I'm curious, are you plant-based because of health reasons, or is it more personal reasons, or a combination?
Well, I started the shift initially for health reasons. The reason that I remain 100% or vegan, as I call myself, is for ethical reasons. Now, like I said earlier, I think that animal foods can factor into a healthy plant predominant diet, and there's certain ones that are better than others. So I'm not going to allow my ethical position sort of bias my take on that. But personally, yeah, that's absolutely why I'm 100%.
And are you someone who, since you have to be so mindful, because I think the other reason it's easier for people to just think about getting a steak for dinner and blah, blah, blah is because the maths, like if you need more protein, you eat a steak. Like it takes a lot more thought, I think, to say, well, let me get a cup of legumes and, let me get some soy. So how do you personally think about hitting your protein requirements in a vegan diet? And is it a muscle you have now, or is it something that you continually just have to kind of be mindful of?
Yeah, I don't think about it at all
Yeah.
anymore.
Okay.
I know I get like 150 grams most days, or somewhere like that, just without even thinking about it now. But it's because I have high protein foods at every meal. Like so, even if I have oatmeal for breakfast, I throw protein powder in because for one, it just makes it taste good. But it adds 20, 30 grams right there. I often have something like tofu with lunch or soy curls or something, and then for dinner, I often have legume based pastas, which are massive, massive protein sources. You could, and I eat a lot, so I'll have a couple servings. It'll be like 50 grams of protein right there, or more. So,
I know.
I find it so easy.
Yeah, people are always surprised. Like you can easily make a vegan lunch and hit 50 grams of protein. Like
Hmm.
I think people still really like don't even think that plants contain protein. They think it's only animal products that are
Hmm.
protein or maybe dairy products. And so
Right. Or
a
if
lot of
it's
these,
plants, it's only nuts and beans.
right, but it's like as you said, every single plant has an amino acid profile. I think people really just genuinely don't understand that. So even if you're just going to have a salad with just some vegetables in it, you are getting amino acids. Like you are that, and that all tallies up throughout the day. That's what else I tell people is like, you'll be surprised, just like how everyone underestimates how many calories they get
Hmm.
when left to their own devices. I think people also do that with protein right now, where you're like, if you are eating a plant forward diet, they tend to think they're underestimating, how much protein they're getting.
I have one last question because I think it's not exactly tied to protein, but related. Um, what about iron? When it comes to iron, certain people have told me, oh, well, I need to get more iron. I'm low in iron, so I need to eat more red meat. What are your thoughts on iron?
Yeah. So, I mean, for starters, it's the most common nutrient deficiency in the world, whether that's among meat eaters or non-meat eaters. It is the most common. Um, there are studies that will look at vegans versus omnivores and rates of iron deficiency, and the rates are about the same, but vegans do tend to have a slightly lower ferritin level, which is the measure of iron in the blood that we typically use. However, when you adjust for inflammation, that sort of goes away. They end up being roughly equal. And that's because inflammation actually raises the ferritin, so like artificially raises it. And so it's not clear, at least in Western populations, that there is really a difference there. Now, the iron from plant foods, the non-heme iron, is generally less bioavailable than the heme iron, but vegans tend to consume way more iron than meat eaters because a lot of these plant foods are very high in iron, legumes, lentils, super high in iron. Um, More so than you even get from meat. It's just the bioavailability changes. So I suspect that one reason we don't see significant differences there between meat eaters and vegans is because yes, the form in the plant foods might be slightly less bioavailable, but you're consuming it with vitamin C often with the fruits and veg, which boosts absorption, and that ends up matching the amount that you get from the animal foods. At the end of the day, if somebody is deficient, I don't see many solutions that are going to be as good as supplementation. like high dose supplementation often needed for raising those levels. And consuming meat for the iron, it might make somewhat of a difference. It's not going to make a massive difference in most cases.
Yeah, I also like my own personal theory is like I think we're looking at iron dysfunction and less, actually not getting enough iron in the diet. Like I think how we utilize it and store it, I think is exactly what you said. It's like connected to inflammation. I feel like what we're going to see in the next decade or so of diagnostics is like a change in how we think about, oh, if someone has low iron, the answer might not be at least only go eat more iron. It might also be like a dysfunction of how we utilize iron, and absorb it from our foods.
Right.
So I'll be interested
Like,
to see that.
are we able to absorb it through the gut? Do we have proper gut function? Are there different parasites that are consuming it from us? Looking further up the chain, looking further for a deeper
Or
root cause.
yeah, or even dysfunction like on the cellular level, and thinking like, are you getting enough vitamin C? Are you getting other things that, are part of what it means to have kind of like functional iron absorption and utilization? But Dr. Nagra, I think like your work is amazing. Thank you for it's been really cool to talk to you. I follow you as I told you, but like it's so clear that you're very passionate about this and that you're very deep in the literature, which even people who, you know, like myself, I have a master's in it. There's lots of people who understand it and can read the literature, but you so clearly have such a grasp on it. So thank you for doing that work and helping sort of clear the myths around food and nutrition, because I think it's rampant. And I feel as somebody who had disordered eating patterns for a lot of my younger life and followed the trends, it breaks my heart because like nutrition shouldn't be about trends. And it's scary to think about people hopping on some of these trends and not really knowing kind of like how to even gauge if it's hurting or helping. So thank you for your work. We're grateful for you. We like to end every podcast asking for some light work for our listeners. And that just means like work that they can do to kind of just bring more light into their lives. Like, it might be something from our conversation. It might be eating more plants, whatever comes to you.
Well, again, thanks for having me on, and yeah, it's been fun, and trying to think about what one little takeaway could be. I think one thing that is pretty simple but could be meaningful, and so far as like the benefits that it has or the habits that it helps build, is I would look at for people watching, look at how you can swap out one source of animal protein for plant protein this week, and then try to make that a consistent thing moving forward. And then obviously from there you can spring off to maybe twice a week, or wherever you go. But try to pick out one of those meals per week and just swap something out.
And see how you feel. Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Naga. Appreciate you. I'm excited for our following to listen to this conversation.
Thank you.